The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeremy Green, and I'm a PCI DSS Qualified Security Assessor for IT Governance. In this webinar, we're going to be looking at the PCI DSS challenge or opportunity. So we're providing you with a practical introduction to the PCI DSS and the guidance on how to achieve, maintain PCI DSS and its compliance more effectively. Please note everybody else is muted for the duration of the webinar. You have the opportunity to enter questions as we go in the webinar console. And if everybody is aware, there's a copy of the presentation slides in the webinar recording, so you can download it yourself. First of all, let's tell you a little bit about IT governance. We'll been helping clients secure their information and compliance with industry standards since 2005. You're probably aware that two of our directors are responsible for the world's first successful implementation of information security management system, which conformed to BS 7799, the forerunner of ISO 27001. IT governance provides a range of services to help clients, protecting their intellectual copyright with GDPR, complying with regular and relevant regulations such as ISO 27001 and ISO 9001, and obviously pushing through on PCI DSS. We offer foundation and advanced level training for the PCI DSS via our e-learning courses or within the face-to-face training. And we're an authorized QSA company. IT governance has been certified by the PCI Security Standards Council to audit merchants for PCI DSS compliant, which means that we as consultants follow the recognized approaches. We get audited by the PCI SSC, and you can find our details on the PCI SSC's website under approved QSA companies. So today we're going to be looking at the 12 requirements for the payment card industry. These relate to the storage, transmission and processing cardholder data. I'll explain the key challenges faced by the merchants and offer recommendations to help achieve and maintain PCI DSS compliance more effectively. We'll look at how compliance with PCI DSS can help you with your GDPR regulation requirements, and hopefully the contents of the webinar will help you introduce the controls for keeping cardholder data secure, explaining some of the technologies in use, the processes and the procedures can assist you in protecting cardholder data. So this is one of those horrible slides, but what it's basically saying is that of all of the breaches, nobody is compliant. And what it means is that whilst we all aim to maintain those controls and put those in place, what we find is as a result of the breach, the situation is very much different, and they're not very difficult to address controls within that environment. So the PCI DSS stands for the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. It was developed to encourage and enhance cardholder data security and to facilitate the broad adoption and consistent data security measure. Despite what everybody thinks, it's potentially not about levying fines from the brands. It is really, as we said, it's to facilitate the broad adoption and consistent security measures to protect cardholder data. It already dates back to the early days. The card schemes during the late 90s and early noughties, in reaction to the surge of breaches, sought to ensure that baseline security was adopted wherever an entity processed, stored or transmitted cardholder data. And you hear that phrase a lot, processed, stored and transmitted is the kind of mantra with PCI DSS. PCI DSS was launched 15th of December 2014. It was first Unified Security standard adopted by the 5 major card brands. Prior to that point, they had their own security standards that they were adopting, and this was the unification of it. And as you can see, it's nearly a 10-year-old standard. It's pretty mature by now. So as a general guidance, any merchants or service provider that stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data is required to comply with the standard. The standard is not law, but non-compliance is punishable by imprisonment. Instead, it's enforced through the terms of business, through their contracts between the merchant, the acquirer, and the payment brand. Organizations that fail to comply are likely to get less beneficial commercial terms, and those that suffer the breach we found have fallen out of compliance are likely to face significant fines. And we'll move on to the fines and those kind of levels. So the PCI uses merchant levels to determine the risk and ascertain the appropriate level of security for the business. And what they've done is they based it on the transaction volumes per year as a gauge to that risk. Specifically, merchant levels determine the amount of assessment and security validation required for each of the merchants to pass PCI DSS assessment. And as we can read through, what we're saying is level 1 merchants are within a 6 million transaction per year criteria and above. Level 2, less risk, 1 million to 6 million. And you can see that the numbers are very large, and we go down all the way down to level 4 merchants. But what we're saying is merchants, regardless of their transaction volumes, are required to comply with PCI DSS. And whilst you may not have been asked by your acquiring bank or perhaps by your merchants if you're a service provider to become PCI DSS compliant, what you'll find is, as we reiterated in the terms and conditions of those contracts, you'll be required to become PCI DSS compliant, especially from your acquiring bank. Your risk level is perhaps sufficiently low that you haven't been asked for it yet. Level 1 merchants must have an external audit performed by a QSA, such as myself, and essentially there's a submission of a report on compliance document. And this is really known as a level 1 on-site assessment. And this is what you submit to your acquiring bank. Merchants of a level can self-assess and submit self-assessment questionnaire via this self-assessment questionnaire mechanism. Regardless of your merchant level, the PCI DSS requires the organization perform a quarterly external vulnerability scan, which is by an approved scanning vendor. This is the ASV. So what we can see on the slide is basically, depending on your level 1 breakpoint, you need to either do a self-assessment questionnaire or you need an external company to come in and do, it could be an internal QSA within your own business, but essentially there's that breakpoint in transaction volumes. And regardless of this, if you are doing it, then you need an approved scanning vendor to scan with the perimeter of your cardholder data environment. What we're also saying is that third parties that support merchants who transmit payment card data on behalf of them are required also to be PCI DSS compliant. The standard additionally requires the contracts to be in place between the merchant and the service provider, and essentially the service provider needs to also attest to their PCI DSS compliance, which is where we get a chain of compliance moving up through the various organizations. So the question we've got is, if implemented correctly, the PCI DSS will help you secure your business data. And whilst it's focusing on a small subset of that data, the whole purpose of the PCI DSS is to protect that cardholder data from hackers and essentially from theft. By following the standard, you can keep your cardholder data secure, avoid data breaches, and protect your employees and your customers from that potential issue. Many organizations simply struggle to know where they are begin with, on which information it seems a very expansive set of controls and requirements, and PCI DSS provides you a framework for those security to help you know what you need to do, which ones to start with. And there are documents such as the prioritized approach, which helps you guide you through those 12 requirements, which ones to start first and which ones you can leave to a latter point. But one of the benefits of the PCI DSS, it provides a detailed action plan applied across all businesses. So it needs to meet the requirements of a small to medium-sized business, a corner shop, all the way up to larger organizations. Obviously, one of the challenges with PCI DSS is through reputational damage. It's also a consideration if you're compromised and lose card data, because the loss will lead to customer confidence issues, and it may be their willingness to continue to do business with you. Winning back those customers will be difficult, and it's a costly process. Whilst we're saying that PCI DSS was developed to provide that basic level of security, there is a fine structure which can be imposed. There are a set of, I guess, fines ranging from tens of thousands of pounds. The consequences of data breach is likely proportional to the seriousness of the breach and the extent to which the merchant is able to demonstrate their compliance with PCI DSS, which means that if you are doing PCI DSS, have a breach, you should be able to demonstrate, and the fine levels will be adjusted accordingly. For level 1 merchants, the combinations fine, litigation, brand damage are going to be significant. For non-level 1 merchants, this could potentially include, there'll be the cost of forensic investigations, which you need to bring that cost in, which could be on a pro rata basis, but typically around about £1,000 a day. And depending on how much evidence you have, if they have to spend a lot of time hunting it because you're logging or your records are poor, then your costs will increase. You also, as a merchant, automatically become a level 1 merchant, and therefore require a report on compliance, which will obviously give you an annual fixed cost that you're going to have to absorb as part of that process. You may get charges that come through on a per transaction basis, or could be one-off fines. And in the worst case, as a merchant, you may lose the ability to accept payments. One of the bigger problems in the US is going to be litigation, and the actual perhaps class action against you as an organization would be significant and probably outweigh the level of fines that are applied by the brands. We now also have the issue of the GDPR regulations coming in. They became law on the 21st of April, and they become enforced on the 25th of May 2018. They will also require businesses to take PCI DSS more seriously, because the link between card data and personal data is clearly defined, and if you aren't securing the card data effectively, you will also potentially be subjected to the GDPR restrictions, because your personal data isn't being protected adequately. So under GDPR, all personal data breaches must be reported by supervisory authorities. In the UK, that will be within 72 hours. And failure to report breaches, you're going to end up with perhaps somewhere around the 10 million euro or 2% of annual turnover. So again, a significant set of fine structures to urge you to take the protection of, in this case, EU citizens' personal data, of which cardholder data forms part of that information. So this statistic's worth keeping in mind. According to TrustWave 2017 Global security report, payment card data is usually the main target for attack against commercial environments, such as point of sale systems and the e-commerce infrastructure. And more than half the incidents investigated targeted payments and card data. So what we're finding is that card data is still an incentive. Whilst we've got things like ransomware as being a lucrative criminal revenue generator, the stealing of card data still represents a high proportion. In the 2015 Hidden Data Economy report by the Intel Security Group, McAfee Labs estimate the price of stolen cards were somewhere around 15 to £30 each in the UK, and somewhere equivalent of 20 to 35 in the European Union. So there is money to be had from the theft of card data, and the more cards you have available to be stolen, obviously the more risk there is that they will target you as an organization. So the way that the PCI DSS structures the requirements and what are a set of goals. So the goal is to build and maintain a secure network. They really want you to follow a set of documented standards when configuring security in the network devices that you use. And we all think this is fairly obvious, that we should maintain our firewall infrastructure and we should build standards for those items. That's one of the big areas where businesses are still not compliant. Requirement 1 addresses the installing and maintaining of firewall configuration standards to protect cardholder data. Firewall controls the transmission of the data between the organization's trusted internal networks and untrusted external network. So requirement 1 is really saying, let's compartmentalize as much as possible what is the cardholder data environment and what is the perimeter, and protect anything going in or out of that environment. And requirement 2 focuses on hardening all of those systems and assets within that environment. The default settings of many common used systems are well known and easily exploitable and often used by hackers to compromise those systems. So all the vendor defaults should therefore be changed, default passwords changed, default accounts removed before you actually get those systems installed onto your network. The reality is there's inconsistent or no build standards in place in most organizations, and that's where the problem lies, is they're insecure to start with. The second goal is to protect cardholder data. So this section of the PCI DSS contains provision regarding the use of effective security controls for the storage and transmission of sensitive card data. And requirement 3 is looking at that cardholder data at rest. You need to know where your credit card data flows from inception, where it traverses a network, where it resides and where it ends up. As you can follow it through, you can then make an assessment and a judgment as to where that cardholder data is. So your cardholder data storage will get to a minimum. Appropriate data retention policy should be in place. There should be disposal policies, and all of those procedures and processes should be around that protection and transmission of cardholder data. And then requirement 4, which is generally well managed in most organizations now, is the use of strong cryptography and secure protocols to transmit that data across those boundaries. And that's generally not so much of a problem with organizations these days with a move to TLS 1.2 and onward. Requirement goal, the next goal is around the antivirus software, secure encoding practices, and it's all grouped together. So what it's saying is protect your systems and build your systems effectively. So requirement 5 states that organizations should protect against malware. Is generally obvious and well maintained at the moment. Most organizations are putting in anti-malware on all systems, and the notion that systems such as an operating system such as Linux are now essentially not vulnerable. But there's been a, over the couple of years, there's been a change in that view, and everything is now having anti-malware, anti-software installed on it. And then requirement 6 is to do with not just the software development, but potentially the implementation of solutions that involve scripting and other forms of coding to develop the solutions. And most businesses are moving away from potentially using in-house resources to develop bespoke code, and the use of external companies who are specifically looking at the security and the securing of those frameworks. They're all in place. The next goal is focusing on how organizations enable and restrict access to the cardholder data and physical access limitations on that cardholder data. So they've grouped all of the role-based and the identity and authentication into a single goal, which is implement strong access control measures. So requirement 8 is looking at the roles-based elements, identifying and authenticating access to systems components. It states that all users must be assigned a unique ID, which must be managed according to specific guidelines, and you should control user authentication management also be used because of 3/4 of all network intrusion exploits are through weak passwords or stolen. There's a move now to obviously implement two-factor authentication. That'll be coming into force in a lot of areas within PCI DSS at the beginning of February 2018. Requirement 9 is the physical elements. We understand the physical security generally better, but it's the use of visitor systems, identity and access within those. The move to obviously data centers is helping a lot with the satisfying requirement 9. The 5th goal is looking at the monitoring of the systems and as well as the testing of those controls. So whilst we've looked at the previous set of controls, we've built our system securely, we know who's accessing them, we have identity and access controls in place. What we're now going to do is, with this goal, is to test and use security and event monitoring to determine whether those controls are effective in place. If you've done the building process correctly and data is controlled in and out of that, we should find that the systems are up to date and there shouldn't be very much that happens within the tracking and also revealed by the testing. So requirement 11 requires you to monitor and test the security systems. It'll validate whether your risk management processes are functioning, and it will also determine whether the scanning and the penetration testing is valid. The PCI DSS compliance, especially for the report compliance and some self-assessment questionnaires, requires internal and external penetration tests to be carried out at least annually, as well as any significant change in the network. Exploitable vulnerabilities found during the penetration testing must be corrected and tested, and then repeat to confirm that those corrections are adequate. So if anything's found during that testing phase, then you're going to have to remediate and fix those before you can say that you are compliant with PCI DSS. And so finally, what we've now got is the requirement to have an information security management system in place. Often it's just focusing on a policy, but what you'll see is when you're looking at the PCI DSS, each of those requirements we've run through all require documented policies and procedures. The information security management system is going to act as an overarching policy to control how those controls are implemented, how they're maintained, and ensure that you maintain PCI DSS compliance all year, not just the audit interval. So whilst we looked at the early slide to say everybody is, when compromised, won't have sufficient controls in place, what that's also reiterated by the latest 2017 Verizon payment report is that businesses are still not reaching full PCI DSS compliance. Only half the organizations will be compliant, and that's the big concern. Normally year one compliance is fairly effective while the business is focused and looking at it. What happens in year two is we all believe that those processes, policies and procedures are now embedded as a business as usual, and the reality is that that is not often the case, and you suffer from a lack of evidence and a lack of controls being followed within the year two, and things improve year three onwards while everybody gets it embedded back into the business. And PCI DSS 3.2 is aiming to make a lot more of those controls business as usual, especially for service providers. So what we're looking at here is that of all of the organizations that were breached, broken down by requirement, there is a kind of pattern as to which parts of the standard are well maintained and which parts of the standards are poorly implemented on a continuous business as usual basis. So as we pointed out, the transmission data via secure encrypted methods such as TLS 1.2, it isn't a problem. There's less issues. It's around the 20% businesses. What we find then is, interestingly, that testing doesn't occur effectively throughout the year, and businesses aren't tracking or monitoring access to cardholder data to provide those audit trails. And those are the kind of 2 points. Some of it, antivirus should be well established, and it should not have an issue. Most businesses. So what we're saying is businesses aren't consistently maintaining the security controls all year round. It leaves them vulnerable between those points, those breaches, and the fact that organizations are consistently maintaining security controls on an ongoing basis is a key to delivering the PCI DSS 3.2. As we said, my findings are normally year one is very good, year two, they haven't managed to maintain business as usual. So let's look at what the realities that business face with implementing PCI DSS, and then the challenges moving forward. So despite the fine levels we've looked at, many merchants aren't PCI DSS compliant. I guess the reasons that they fail to maintain are a lack of awareness, inadequate scoping. They underestimate the technical complexity of the standard, not to mention the great strain caused by having to comply with a broad range of other standards, laws and regulations. So what we're going to see with obviously the focus on GDPR is that people are going to say, I can't do all of these. And that's going to be the stress of maintaining PCI DSS. So get your PCI DSS environment scoped effectively. just because you've got too many things to do doesn't mean to say that you can ignore the PCI DSS requirements, because not least because organizations found to be non-compliant could incur heavy fines. And so to avoid this, you need to acknowledge the challenge of complying with PCI DSS and find a way to overcome these. So PCI DSS 3.2 is looking to have the concept of charters in place so that at your C-level board, everybody's aware of the need to maintain and continue with PCI DSS. First of all, so recap, first of all, those insufficient scoping of the cardholder data environment. Many merchants lack a clear definition of the scope of the payment environment for PCI DSS certification. It's because there's a range of activity involved in the underlying maintaining that standard. It seems so broad. It ranges from very technical at the firewall levels all the way through to an information security policy. Generally, you either have a problem where the scope is too narrow and you can lead to cardholder being compromised because your scope isn't adequately recognized. And if the scope is too broad, you can obviously increase the cost of implementing it. Organizations I talk to say, well, we might as well just make everything in scope for PCI DSS. And what they soon find out is that the costs of maintaining perhaps the monitoring or the security and event monitoring, as well as the penetration testing, spiral out of control because they're too costly. So you've got to get your scoping right. It's got to be sufficiently small, PCI DSS, CDE, but at the same time, that's got to be embedded as business as usual, too broad, and you suffer the challenges of the costs being too high. If we look at requirements 10.6.1, means that there's the daily review of security and events. If you've got too many events in your scope, you're going to struggle to maintain that moving forward. You might find that there's a lack of technical or budgetary human resource restrictions that give you challenge of problems there. It also puts additional pressure on those responsible managing the systems that must be logged. And if the environment isn't actively monitored, then you'll have problems there. Breaches are likely to go on for a lot longer if they're not detected. So the wider your scope, with the more noise occurring within the security event monitoring, the more likely it will be is that you miss critical alerts or critical elements, and the breach will occur for a lot longer. Quite a few organizations fall out of compliance because of the fail to recognize the importance of regular testing. So what we've said is that you build and maintain a secure solution system, you control access via firewalls, you have identity and authentication controls in place, but you then don't go and validate that those were done effectively. So when we looked at the 27th Verizon payments report, when we're looking at requirement 11, what we're saying here is that only 71, nearly 72% of the breaches fail because of those very high statistics. Most organizations perform little or no regular testing on the adequacy of the security controls. They don't govern their network, and they're not really looking at the internet-facing firewall or the web applications. So if you aren't regularly testing and you aren't regularly validating it, that's where you'll have a problem with maintaining PCI DSS, and you'll have issues. Biggest challenge that I'm having with most organizations is documenting the PCI policies and procedures. It can be significantly challenging to take what essentially is perhaps your ISMS, which is risk-based, and when you're looking at PCI DSS, you're potentially looking at somebody having done the risk assessment and determining that a specific set of controls are in place, and it doesn't quite fit. My best solution to this is turn all the PCI DSS requirements into a set of controls, blend those with your ISMS, and try to tackle them as a pre-established risk assessment. If you haven't got an ISMS in place, then you're going to have to build that level of documentation across all of the 12 requirements. So, and lastly, lots of organizations do make an error of separating PCI compliance from their overall IT governance risk management compliance program. But as we said, PCI DSS is baseline information security standard. It's the basic set of controls that you should have in place, and the compartmentalizing exercise is going to cause you problems where it isn't business as usual, and it isn't embedded, and it isn't well maintained from year to year. So build those into your ISMS, make it effective by building it into your ISMS, and you'll be in a good position just to take the controls as a set of good practice, basics level of security, which would match up. So, how to manage your PCI DSS compliant? The recommendations are conduct a PCI DSS gap analysis. You can either do that yourselves, or you can get an external consultant in to assist you with that gap analysis exercise. It's a matter of understanding what the requirements say and how you interpret them. That's the challenge that most implemented project managers have, where they try to read the control and understand what the intent was. So the other approach is to do a pre-audit, go through the exercise and check that where each of the controls needs a policy or procedure or evidence, that you collect that and you go through the exercise as a pre-audit to do it. Give yourself a month in advance of your assessment date and go through and do a pre-audit yourselves. Again, you can see that getting an external QSA in to assist you with that process will help you. So there are a couple of approaches. The gap analysis often proposed before a formal assessment, as we're saying, by a QSA, especially if you're doing an attestation of compliance. You can establish whether you are ready for that formal report if you're doing a ROC, and it goes through the rigor of doing an assessment rather than you filling in a self-assessment questionnaire and potentially going, yes, those controls are in place. I haven't definitely proved it, but the IT guys have said yes, that those controls are in place. One of the challenges with the PCI DSS is getting your scope right. The scope too large, it will absorb your company's energies and resources. You can reduce the costs with that by, I guess, focusing on what the scope is up front, determine which areas, organizations the actual controls will apply to. So the best way of simplifying PCI DSS is to reduce the scope of the standard, find out through your data discovery exercise, your data flow diagrams, and go through and determine exactly where cardholder data is, what format it is in, if it's encrypted, unencrypted. Try and draw yourself a map of that going across the business. And if you find there are areas where it is leaking out, then start to draw some dotted lines around and try and fix your CDE to be a very well segmented but obvious, well maintained area. So analyze your cardholder data stored, processed or transmitted. Try to reduce the number of locations where that is kept. Consolidate systems such that your cardholder data isn't spread around multiple systems. It will be difficult to maintain and manage those. You can then achieve a level of segmentation, and with that segmentation you can isolate it from essentially the rest of the network, which you may determine to be weak and leaves less controls in place. The final option is outsource it to third parties, move your scope, reduce your scope take the CDE and move it to a third party, host it in a data center, get third parties to manage your CDE, and essentially have less access. Now, obviously, your cost to implement those may be slightly higher, but you will at least have reduced the scope of the CDE, because you'll be clear cut that as soon as you get a third party to use it, there will be boundaries around that CDE when you achieve it. Now, what we said is you've built your systems securely, you've have limited access to those systems. What you still need to regularly test those. And that's where the biggest issue becomes, which is most successful attacks carried out are because of lack of patching, and that's the primary focus. You need to make sure that that patching process is occurring now within a regular timescale, and you are in a good position to validate. So document your business practices, make sure that it's business as usual and that you haven't got any issues with your policies and procedures, and then conduct a regular risk assessment to make sure that you're including all of the regular systems into that scope. So you can use PCI DSS as a tool for getting GDPR to compliance. So at the start of the presentation, I described why organizations take PCI DSS more seriously. You've got this fine, you've got the General Data Protection Act is in less 6 months' time. So if you are securing your cardholder data, you're in a good position to move forward and at least that cardholder data. You can obviously adopt the same sort of processes that you're applying to your cardholder data to other personal data that sits within your systems. So both PCI DSS and the GDPR aim to ensure organizations secure personal data, but the PCI DSS focuses on the payment card and cardholder data, while GDPR focuses on European residents' personal data. And an important difference is that GDPR is less prescriptive than PCI DSS. So you've got two ends of the spectrum. PCI DSS is saying these are very regimented controls that need to be in place, and GDPR is more flexible at this stage, and it's up to you to interpret how those are. Some recommendations that people have said is, you know, it's hard work, but you could use PCI DSS as a benchmark for applying good security practice to all of your data that's held within those systems. So GDPR provides guidance on what needs protecting, but doesn't provide detailed action plans. And PCI DSS looks at very specifically what those action plans are and all the controls in place. So there are three main areas where PCI DSS can assist you with their efforts to achieve compliance with GDPR. So protect and store cardholder data, part of requirement 3 is PCI DSS, and you can, as a minimum, protect the PAN, and the CVV2 shouldn't be anywhere in your environment. Therefore, you should be in a good position to satisfy the requirements of GDPR. Article 25 of the GDPR states that logs and records should be maintained for all activities. And what we're saying is that if you were to implement your requirements for in 10 and look at 10.6.1, you already have a logging and event management system in place, which you can use and leverage for GDPR. So you will have something in place to help you with the auditing of the systems. So if you're trying to validate the costs of those, then you should be in a good position to say, we've now got a tool that is needed for GDPR and for PCI DSS. And what we said in requirement 12 is also reiterated in Article 35, is you're going to have information security policy built. Now, what you're going to have to do is tune that so that it is less about cardholder data, and you may find that you need to branch out, have information security policy that talks about a card data policy as a sub-policy, and then address all of the personal data that forms part of GDPR. But you will have a framework that suits both. So first steps to compliant: scope your environment, reduce the scope, but don't make it so small it's not business as usual. Do a gap analysis to find out where card data is, how it's flowing around the system. Once you know where it's sitting and at rest, remember transmission is fairly well taken care of. So as it's transmitting across those boundaries, you should be less worried because it's already been well secured. And you're either going to be completing a self-assessment questionnaire, or you're going to get an external company to do the on-site assessment. So this is part of a number of webinars that we're running on PCI DSS compliance. There are a few more dates there that you'll be able to pick up from the slide, and we should now be able to look at any questions that anybody's raised. I can have a quick open up, see if anybody's raised any questions. Which there are lots of. The question is, if we outsource the processing of payments to a third party, so long as we are PCI certified and they do not handle the card data, this means that they do not have to be PCI certified to receive those payments? So my understanding of the question is you as the organization have to be PCI DSS certified, because it would imply that you're the merchant, you have the merchant account, and therefore you're responsible for the protection of cardholder data. Because you're using a third party, you need to ensure that they have taken on the responsibility of being they will take on the responsibility of handling the card data, so they will be PCI DSS compliant as a service provider. So unfortunately, both of you need to be PCI DSS certified, but obviously as the merchant in this case, all of the controls and all the requirements you will be offloading to your service provider, and your attestation of compliance or potentially your self-assessment questionnaire is going to be smaller, and you're going to use a subset of the controls that you need to apply and say all the rest are handled by my service provider. Second question here. Oh no, same question. It's going through. In that instance, what would be our responsibility to assess the supplier beyond checking that their third party has a valid PCI DSS certificate? So the answer is you have to trust that they will supply you with a attestation of compliance, and at that point you will, by your contractual relationship with them, because you'll have determined that when you engage them that you had a sufficient contract in place to say, and you shall protect cardholder data and you shall comply with PCI DSS. Don't put a version number in because they'll get out of that. That's how you accept it. If contractually you don't trust them, then you can ask them to obviously have an external assessment by a QSA, and that would be a valid approach. I've been involved in similar exercises where I've been asked as a service provider to do a service provider essentially level 1 assessment and get a QSA in and independently verify. If you are concerned and you feel that your contract won't be sufficient, then I would go down that route. It's difficult if you're already engaged with a service provider and you're retrospectively enforcing PCI DSS requirements on them, because I would want to renegotiate my contract with you as that service provider in that instance. Extension of the question, how would we know that the PCI DSS certification body, I assume, is authorized and qualified to assess companies? You can look on the PCI SSE's website. There's a list of QSA companies. You will not be able to find out, apart from looking at their attestation of compliance. If they've done externally, you should be able to tie up that attestation of compliance with a QSA company from the PCI SSE's website. If you want to ask a couple more questions, we actually haven't got that many. Next question. So are you saying that 91% of companies that didn't track and monitor? No, what we were saying is of the breaches that occurred, that a problem was that the 91% of those 91% of those organizations that were breached didn't track and monitor effectively and weren't actually compliant with PCI DSS. That's the situation we're at with that. We've kind of run out of questions, but I guess a couple of options. No, we've got a few more questions coming in. Quite a long one. If hopefully I'll sanitize it if it's too encrypting. As we know, it's a violation of PCI DSS requirement for any merchant to store any sensitive payment authorization data after authorization, even encrypted. Doesn't mean it's possible for an external third party to facilitate recurring payments by securing stored credit card details. Okay, there are some elements within the PCI DSS 3.2 that enables you as a card issuer, or you need to do issuing type functions that you do store sensitive authentication data. It is possible for you to say, as a business function, that we need to store that. And as long as you're applying essentially the controls around PCI DSS, you can claim that you are, as a business, need to do that. Let's just say, by secure. So the rest of the question is, by securely storing credit card details and interface with a payment gateway, therefore ensuring that merchants would not directly access those details, and therefore ensure PCI DSS compliance from the merchant perspective. There is no problem with a merchant relying on you as a third party providing that service to store credit card details, as long as you are encrypting it. Yep. Another question. Okay. Would an organization using self-signed certificates to secure data in transit? No, you won't pass the scans using self-signed certificates. You need to get, if it's internal, may be valid, but if external, you can't use self-signed certificates because you won't pass the PCI DSS scanning tests with self-signed certificates. We've still got more time. It says here, we're scanning our system for card data and finding our sales claim team put card data into notes field. Yes, big problem. Do know the one. Do we have to remove the data? Yes, you do, because it's stored electronically. Is it sufficient to send out comms to our teams and never to put card data in notes? Yes, so the remediation is your training and awareness is probably not effective. If you look at requirement 12, you need to obviously train your staff about information security. You need to reiterate that. I would say that you probably have an issue with your information security policy, how it's been issued, and how everybody should be aware of the cardholder data. You may have a too narrowly defined team that not everybody's seen that. You need to redact it. You can have a failure, but obviously then demonstrate that you're going to remediate. It's not part of your designed process. It's an exception. Redact, remediate, and part of that is reissue your information security policy. Perhaps have a quiz, make sure they understand it. Question, what was the geographic distribution of the Verizon report? I think you'll find that it was just US and it was only their customers. So therefore we've got quite a narrowly defined view of it. I think it's interesting, but my feeling is, being a QSA and going around and obviously assessing organizations, it's about right as a snapshot of the world. I have done audits in a number of countries and it doesn't differ. I've been asked to reiterate the question about I'm a merchant and I've fully outsourced. So the answer is, if you're a merchant and you have a merchant ID, you're responsible for PCI DSS. All you would need to do is validate that your elements of requirement 12, which is managing your third parties, would need to be in place, and that you have an information security policy. That's all you'd have to do, but you still need to be PCI DSS compliant, even down that level. It's your merchant ID. If it wasn't your merchant ID, it's not your problem. All you've done is asked a third party to manage the security for you. Next question. I'm struggling because it's multiple parts of a question running down multiple lines. What are the PCI DSS requirements on banks who issue Visa and MasterCard credit cards? The ones that I've talked to, basically, they're issuers. So if you're talking Visa, then Visa don't issue cards. Essentially, banks do, and essentially you have a series of card issuers. They have to comply with PCI DSS, and therefore the issuing process, because obviously you've got a sensitive authentication data, you've got an encrypted PAN. A good example would be if you were a business printing out the cards and delivering them to the customers directly, you would have to be PCI DSS compliant. The bank could then say that they don't need to issue the cards, and therefore they've got a third party to issue them securely. Probably your best approach to go down that route. So we've got about 3 minutes to go, according to my clock. I'll recap. We're talking about self-signed certificates. Yes, self-signed certificates for internal communication with apps would be sufficient, because you are going to struggle to get a certificate chain to work if you have set up your environment sufficiently securely such that those ports aren't open and you aren't allowing that the certificate to be validated out of the entity. Does that answer your question? I've got a yes on that one. That's good. So thank you very much. I think I will probably suggest that, as we have no more questions, that we conclude this webinar. Hopefully you found it interesting. Thank you.